resources because we're passing through the production of those molecules. We've gone to Mars, but we haven't simulated the marijuana plant. So let's just assume that that's still a pretty epic undertaking. But then ultimately, then the application of that into a health system and our expectations of mitigating those health issues that are there because the endocannabinoid system is underregulating or misregulating, insufficiently regulating the system that results in sometimes mental issues, sometimes more physical issues. But the fact is there are expectations of what those cannabinoids can do. And so the M scale was created to understand that if it's in that list, then our expectations of cannabis might be reasonable. If it's not in that list, then we should probably help you find something else, because a lot of times people are coming to us not in the best shape. We talk about just the general gist of molecules, but I'm going to leave that to Google. But just molecules have shapes, and they're really, really important. When we're dealing with people, maybe I will turn on the. Well, no, I won't. I was just going to do the presentation, so this next slide builds, but you just bear with me at this one. But people are coming to us because, and people are looking and pursuing cannabis because something is unsatisfied about their current treatment. Most people are not picking cannabis first. Why? Well, because there's been a bunch of really scary stuff that's out there, and or maybe not that scary, but just generally believed to be negative information around cannabis, which has nothing to do with cannabis. They got it from the people who smoke cannabis and use cannabis in copious amounts. So it was more like they don't like those people, so they must hate that. But the whole idea that all this centers around either CBD or THC is proof that everybody are dumbasses. Let's just use a very strong word, because it's not even worth pretending. Now, why are people seeking cannabis? Because people have symptomology that's causing some challenge in their lives, or they're using to demonstrate there's challenges in their life. And that gives them a diagnosis. That diagnosis then spurs a prescription solution. If that prescription solution is not satisfactory, it actually goes back and usually re-influences the symptomology, which then kind of changes the diagnosis. And that was the original project, which is why are all these physicians in certain areas prescribing 30, 40, 50 prescriptions per patient, right? Ultimately resulting in what we call the opioid epidemic. Well, one of the reasons is because they were not addressing, it's not even the elephant in the room, it's what everything's standing on to include the elephant, but that's the root cause. We miss the root cause, we end up having symptomology. Well, the weird thing about cannabis is that, like prescriptions, because of the endocannabinoid system being at the root cause of so many dysregulated things, cannabis also works better at the root cause and sucks at symptomology unless you want to be high. So chasing all those symptoms is actually not what cannabis is good at. You can get really ripped and you may not care about them, but reach on to somebody who's got pain that's high, they hurt just as much as they did, they just kind of forgot about it a little bit. Whereas when you end up dealing with somebody whose pain is based on inflammation, if we address the inflammation, then they don't have that pain. You know why? Because their physician can assess that and say, hey, you don't have that pain. They can do big measurements. There's all kinds of ways to be able to suggest that you've actually addressed the issue rather than mask it. Why? Again, because the endocannabinoid system is at the root causation or the root control or the root manager of a lot of the issues that ultimately we have challenges with. So the ECS has this really interesting series of, like I said, of these receptors. It's very important because the other part is that if certain cannabinoids go and interact with CB1 type receptors, and if cannabinoids go in other directions and hit CB2 type receptors, then why isn't cannabis given to you and sold to you based on what you're looking for and which direction you need to go? Right? Because I mean, again, if water goes in the radiator and gas goes in the gas tank, this is the only industry that puts all of it all over the inside of your car. And then what are you going to do about it? So you either have a really wet interior of your car or it's all full of gas and it's ready to blow up, but it's weed, so what do we care? Well, if you needed to go somewhere, you would care. Well, with cannabis, because of the expectations being so low, you can hype, strain name, all this stuff, the color, blah, blah, blah. This person sings this song, yada, yada, yada. Of course, it won't matter if we're basically constantly putting either water or gasoline on the inside of your car, because because there was no expectation for it to work in the first place. Where this expectation comes from is the fact that there are these cannabinoids that the body produces. They look like these long chains, kind of like soap molecules, really, because soap has got a bunch of hydroxy or water type molecules on one end and then none on the other end. And so it can grab onto oils and it can grab onto waters, and that's how soap works. Not quite long enough to do that, but that's what they look like. And so this long stringy molecule basically is an example of one of the endo or cannabinoids produced by the body. Nobody uses the name. I love it when like people who are trying and worried that you're going to be smart, like love to just like do weird things that we would call this 2AG. We may even call this AG depending on context. So don't let the weird names, although I do put this stuff in here to get there, but just like everybody else, scientists have to go pick up their kids from soccer and make sure somebody's lunch is made, just like everybody else, just like an attorney, just like, you know, a mechanic. Just, we all have to live in the same world. And so nobody just goes around just, anyway, people of science are the same as everyone else. So here are the 6. You have AEA, 2AG, that's what we just looked at, the NADA, the 2AG, AGE, the AEA, and then the LPI. This is a newer cannabinoid identified, but these are produced in the body. As you notice, none of them are wrapped around, but they actually do wrap around, kind of like that. If you can imagine, that's kind of string with different sized balls at each one of the intersections or where there's a letter. And so that chain kind of wraps around itself in coils, and then that allows the cannabinoid to function. If they were stretched out like this, they wouldn't really be very effective. So what happens is that those receptors are basically asking for help, and they ask for a particular shape. That shape is a geometry and configuration of that long stick, and then it wrapped around, and as it does that, it jiggles. And so that can reach into the receptor, and each one of them can be asking for shape. Again, I'm just trying to use visuals here to kind of facilitate a conversation. But those cannabinoids then reach in there and they get down into the depths. We recently found out that that ligand can be up to 7 carbons long. So if you kind of think of a carbon as like a pearl, and then you have a pearl necklace. So you have this big knot, and then there's a little stick of the pearl necklace. It can be either 1 pearl, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 long. And then that knot goes down in that tail jiggles in the bottom of the receptor. And so we know that that receptor can hear or accept that vibrational beat. So like if there's some beating on it at the 3, 5, and 7 depth, but it can't really do it at the 1 or 2, the 4, or the 6. So this also is pretty interesting because in medicine, we also have things that get in the way of each other. So the reason why people who have, like say, hay fever can take an antihistamine is because there is a molecule that binds right next to the receptor that causes you to sneeze. And again, that's a bit oversimplified, but and what it does is it just physically blocks the pollen molecule from interacting with the part of the receptor that would cause you to have the allergic reaction. Well, let's say that the pollen molecule, which it doesn't, but if it did, if it had to reach down into the receptor, so you had a pollen molecule that was too short, that pollen molecule could bind with the receptor and then prevent a longer pollen molecule from getting down there and actually causing the problem. But that would be sufficient also. And so in this particular case, cannabinoids can actually get in each other's way, the same ones. And that's often attributed to CBD. Based on how they bind, that would be a completely false premise. But it doesn't mean that CBD doesn't do something, and it doesn't mean that they're not doing something. I'm just saying is that they're not really in competition with one another like that. And the reason is because if you had somebody who had the ability to drive 50 miles an hour, and you had somebody who had the ability to walk with a cane, on the freeway, we really don't have that much of a competition with people who are walking with canes and then somebody who does the ability to drive at freeway speeds. Now, person who's walking with a cane probably is more apt to be configured to have a conversation with somebody. And the person in the car driving at 60 miles an hour or 70 or whatever probably doesn't have as much capability of having a conversation with somebody next to them. So they're not in competition. And you don't need a person who's having a conversation about how the day is to help the person who's traveling that distance. And so not all cannabinoids necessarily are needed with each other. Some of them are, some of them aren't, some of them get in each other's way, some of them don't. So the fact is that the relationships are more complicated than like the entourage effect crap or the ratios. It's just, I don't know, it'd be like somehow somebody who's a vegetarian regulating somebody who's doing rib barbecue. They're just completely separate places. And so somebody might be able to tie something together, but they're just completely different animals. So all of which are basically competing for the receptors that are going to allow them to interact with them. When we are talking about where the cannabinoids come, a lot of times we'll try to help people understand this, especially with people who have kind of an affinity to believe in strain names. And the idea is that the cannabinoids are actually not produced in the plant. They're not really produced on the surface of the plant. They're produced in these little globules. So that's where the kitchens are. And the precursor materials are being delivered there. And then there's the enzymatic process that basically starts to assemble those things into the first cannabinoid, which is the class CBG. There are 4 vibrational states there, and there can be up to 7 ligand lengths. So there's technically 28 cannabinoids in the CBG family. They are the master category, the very first. So an example that I would use is, we all know what a seed is, but if we had a seed from a tree, and somebody's like, oh, you got a tree in your hand? We all understand that we have a tree in our hand, even though it's technically not a tree because it's a seed. When the seed sprouts and you got the little sprout and you put it in a little dirt and you got that little tiny tree, now we know that's definitely the tree. That's the first, that's kind of the first here. And then it's going to grow up and convert into 11 other versions of that tree in this particular case, right? So strangely enough, the pine tree is going to become an apple tree, a pear tree, and a Doug fir. And then they're going to keep going on to these different classes. We're going to have multiple versions of those trees. So in CBG, there's 28, 4 master vibrations with the ability to reach into the receptor 1 to 7 lengths. So when this happens, we end up creating what's called a phytocannabinoid. Phytocannabinoid is not a one-to-one replacement for the endocannabinoid. An endocannabinoid is that long stringy thing. And as you can see over there on the left, the phytocannabinoid is not long and stringy. It looks like there's these hexagons or these rings. And it's true because the phytocannabinoid is simulating what the endocannabinoid needs to achieve in its twisted upness in order to function. So this, again, I don't necessarily believe in like some of the beautiful stories about how plants have this consciousness to them. Not mad at anybody who does. It is pretty cool stories, like the Botany of Desire is a wonderful story to read and makes you feel really good. But somehow these plants have basically created these complementary molecules that are basically what the body intends their molecules to be. It also protects them with some carbon dioxide. And so the heating of those molecules ultimately dries off a carbon dioxide molecule and allows that ligand or that little chain guy to reach down into the receptor. And in this particular case, we're showing one that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 long. The tail is 5 long on the phytocannabinoid on the left. And it's also 5 long, kind of configured them so you can kind of see the similarities. And so they're reaching in down to 5 carbons down, and they're beating on that receptor down there about 5 carbons in. The cannabinoids that are ultimately present in the plant are far more numerous than the human or the mammal or the animal. The first class is CBG. This next 3 classes are THC, CBD, and CBC. And then there are a total of 12 different families, each of which have different numbers of vibrations associated with them that then now go on to have 7 lengths. When that length is 3, it's referred to as V. And so you see a lot of stuff about VVV. Most of that promotion stuff is just based on because nothing else works, so they're just picking the next thing. It doesn't mean that V isn't important to the receptor. It just means that the people who are talking about it seem to not really know too much about it, and so they just say stuff. So it's just kind of like maybe probably some people out there that really know a lot about baseball. There's probably, they know every statistic and every fact. And they're probably hanging out with people who love to drink beer with them, who then mess all those facts up and talk about complete crazy crap about stuff. Well, most of